Welcome to Influence and Insight, the series from the Financial Services Forum, which talks to the most interesting thinkers in financial services marketing about their careers and the ideas that have shaped their thinking. So I'm here with Conrad Ford from Allica Bank. So welcome to the podcast, Conrad. As a sort of first question to kick us off then, could you just talk me through your career, how you've ended up where you are?
Yeah, so I think I'm quite notable for lacking a plan in my career. Cast ourselves back to the third year of university. I was at a fairly prestigious university, and I was living with a friend. And one day they just turned up in the living room in a suit. I'm like, why are you in a suit? Someone died, you know? And he said, no, it's the graduate recruitment fair. And this whole thing had passed me by. What I didn't do is, at the end of university, get myself into a graduate trainee or anything. And I kind of stumbled out, blinking out of university in my early 20s and decided to go and see the world. Got on a plane to India, thinking that I could see the whole world in 6 months. And I discovered that I was a very slow traveller. So 2 months later, I was on the same beach as where I'd arrived. And that led to me spending most of my 20s travelling and doing temporary jobs in the summer, and then escaping the horrible British winter in travelling abroad. So I got my first proper job when I was 26. So a fierce auntie had sat me down and told me I needed to get a qualification. And the only way I could do that and maintain a reasonable standard of living was to go into investment banking and study accountancy. So I was in the Wolf of Wall Street type bit of banking for a little while, or it's not like the Wolf of Wall Street, I should assure you. Studied accountancy. I'm a qualified accountant, believe it or not. But as soon as I finished studying accountancy, I kind of thought, right, I want to do something different with my life. And I decided at this point that strategy sounded interesting. So I got myself a job in strategy in one of the big banks. And I'll say that was the first time I had a job that felt like a career. In other words, I was doing something I thought maybe I'm quite good at this. And this is actually quite interesting. So I spent 3 or 4 years, happy years, albeit very hard working doing strategy. And then I had what I call my midlife crisis, and I decided I needed to found a business. So I think, you know, I'm only half joking when I say midlife crisis. I was kind of thinking, well, I'm in my 30s now. I've really achieved nothing. And if I look back at the sort of kid I was and the ambitions I had, I'll be very disappointed with myself. So I decided to start a startup, as was the fashion at the time. I founded a fintech startup, which I ran, scaled. I was the sole founder for 7 or 8 years. It's now been bought by a larger fintech, I'm glad to say. So there was a successful outcome for the business, which is great. And then I decided to join Allica Bank and build a new bank, which I've been doing for the last 5 years or so. And believe it or not, we've become the fastest growing company in the UK, which has been really exciting.
So do you think that traveling for 5 years, studying, I think, sociology at uni, do you think that those things led to your career at all, or do you think it was just a happy accident? Do you think you just...
Not at all is the answer. So there's a very popular theory around at the moment. There's a book called Range. And Range is basically summarizing a growing body of academic research, which suggests that those that have meandering careers end up being more successful over time. And that's actually very counterintuitive to what we're all taught when we're at school, which is, you know, get yourself into a particular career line of focus. But the reality is that the growing body of evidence is quite the opposite. And I think potentially I'm accidentally an example of that. So why is it that they believe this is the case? I think there's a number of factors. The first one is when you're young, you've got no idea what you're born to do. And I don't mean that in some tweet Instagram way, but basically you're going to be very good at certain things, you're going to be bad at others. And I'd say one of the great career mistakes that people made, and I certainly made in my 20s, is I spent far too much time covering up what I was weak at rather than focusing on what I was good at. And we'll talk about my weaknesses. I have many, but in the end, right? So if you meander a bit, as I did, you kind of potentially stumble upon what you were actually born to do in terms of your, your raw materials, your DNA, your purpose. But also, interestingly, in science in particular, most of the great scientific breakthroughs have come when someone's come from a different field and brought a very different perspective. And I think that's a strength that I have because I've had such a meandering career, that I will sometimes see things fundamentally and profoundly different to my colleagues, even colleagues who are at least as intelligent and often more intelligent than me. that kind of, you just profoundly see things differently, and suddenly things take a big leap forward. So yeah, I think it's around, to the extent I've been successful in my career, it's because I've had the opportunity to explore the many things I was not born to do. And over time, I've become more and more focused on what I think I'm particularly strong at.
Do you think that you are more suited to one side or the other, corporate? Because some people can only thrive in a startup environment. Some people are really suited to corporate life. Do you sit anywhere on that spectrum, I suppose?
I think I'm more at the earlier stage, but I think the nicest place for me, and I actually think for most people, by the way, is the kind of middle ground, perhaps scale up. So let's just unpick that a bit. In the very, very early stages of a startup, things are utter chaos. And there's this constant sense of panic and this constant sense of doom. Now, it probably sounds quite over-egged, but the reality is, right, if you're a sole founder, as I was, multiple times I was staring down the barrel that I'd probably have to walk out into the office in the next 2 weeks and tell people it was over. They weren't going to get paid and they had no jobs left. So that kind of like constant fear of running out of money really weighs on you. And actually there's the chaos of not having the famous product market fit. At the other extreme, large corporates, largely speaking, not all of them, but largely speaking, the vast majority have just become bureaucratic messes. Nothing ever really gets done. No one really achieves anything, and most jobs are supporting other jobs. And by the way, just as an aside, having been on both sides of the equation, I'm pretty confident if I went back into the big bank, I used to work in the head office where there's 5,000 people in this huge tower. I'm pretty sure, like the Matrix, within a month I could just see through all the nonsense and just identify the probably 2/3 of people that don't need to be there. In other words, their jobs exist because of other people's jobs. They're producing PowerPoint for other people, documents, etc. Now, the middle ground, the scale up, I think is probably the best balance between it's interesting and exciting, but it's also not crazy and scary. And I think at the heart of that is the famous product market fit. So in the early stages of a startup, unless you're really lucky, unless you're WhatsApp or Instagram, those ones that just hit it perfectly right first time. And famously, for example, Airbnb went through multiple iterations or pivots before they got there. So that's a more classic startup journey. I think in those days, decision-making is like spraying a machine gun. You just have too many things coming at you. You're just making random decisions, most of them wrong, most of them missing. And then there's kind of a magical moment as you transition from startup to scale up, or you have your product market fit, where suddenly most things work and you become much more clinical, more like a sniper. It's okay, this month I'm going to finally resolve that thing that doesn't work in the business. I'm going to delve deep on it. I'm going to find out the issues. I'm going to get the data. I'm going to figure it out. So it's exciting because there's constant intellectual challenge, but it's not crazy and it's not scary. I think certainly for my age and stage of life, that's probably the right place to me. But I do still love building stuff. I love launching new channels and products at Allica. That's one of my favorite things to do.
And it's some people love doing, they're sort of serial business starters. They start it, but they know that they're not supposed to be in the business of scaling it up. Or I mean, do you think they're fundamentally different skills? Starting something, scaling something, running something.
I think there's multiple ways of engaging that, and one is what you just said, which is you step aside if you're the startup person. But the reality is, right, it can equally be dealt with by having a balanced founding team. If you just describe the perfect CEO, I suspect that very few of them exist. You kind of need to be a mixture of three things, which in many ways conflict. So one is you need to be the kind of visionary. You need to see the end game. The kind of Jeff Bezos quote, he says, stubborn on the vision, flexible on the details. So you need the visionary side of things. But you also need to be the day-to-day leader, the one who does the stand-ups and makes everyone excited and energized every day. And you also need to be the completer finisher that sees it get done. Now, I reckon a lot of individuals are strong on two of those dimensions. I think very few are strong on three. So there's potentially an argument that says you need a founding team. So for example, I need a completer finisher alongside me. And I also need a day-to-day leader. So I'm quite good at inspiring people about the 5-year vision. Put me on a company offsite and everyone will be pumping their fists at the end. But I'm pretty grumpy in the morning, to be honest. I'm not the person to do a morning stand-up, yeah? Find the people alongside you. And I think a founding team can kind of evolve, right? As you scale up, it's more about the detail. less the vision and the innovation. So I think a founding team, and very often, by the way, you see somebody step up to executive chairman and one of the co-founders becomes CEO. So I think that's the other way. And I'll say a better way as well, because transition from a hired guy manager from a founder is more often than not goes badly. It's the person who got you there, it's their baby, they care, they have passion, and above all else, they have deep corporate memory. They understand what didn't work. Very often when I get new people into an organization, the conversation is, no, we did try that. So in other words, the common wisdom is not going to work here.
And in terms of corporate structures, obviously, you've used the metaphor before of oil tankers and I think motorboats, but the basically an oil tanker, very hard to sink, very hard to change course. Motorboat can sink quite easily, can maneuver quite quickly. When you're transitioning from one stage to the other, how do you keep? Is it possible, I suppose, to keep the agility of a startup, say, as you move to something with something bigger that will be harder to change course?
Yeah, so it can be done, but it's extremely rare for it to have been successfully done. So, for example, Amazon has done it, right? Amazon operates across dozens of territories and dozens of products and still executes at speed. Revolut is a more recent example. The same things are true. Many products, many geographies execute at speed. Probably the number of companies that have done it at scale is probably in the low dozens, if not below a dozen, globally. So what is the answer? The answer is a mix of culture and organizational design. So a book that we're geeking out on about at the moment is called The Geek Way. The Geek Way is basically breaks down, there's quite a few of the ideas and concepts in there are not necessarily new. What it does is package them together really nicely. And the central thesis is that a new type of corporate culture came out of the West Coast of America. We associate it with big tech firms because they were kind of the public exemplars, but the reality is that culture of execution wasn't just tech firms, came out of that area. And these organizations, they have high autonomy, they're less hierarchical. A famous example is Jeff Bezos, for example. He preaches against the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. So in other words, he says, if you're not debating facts and evidence, then it's the highest paid person's opinion. And as he pointed out, the hippo is always him. Yeah. So he's actively asking to be challenged with data and facts. So they have a high degree of autonomy. So we obsess a lot about culture. So you can go and see our values, for example, on our website, and they're very different from the values you'd expect to see at a traditional bank. So, for example, one of our values, one of the things we say is no preening. We say others value headcount, titles, meetings they attend. We only value outcomes you deliver. We want to send a really clear statement in our language and our positioning that we are different from a corporate perspective. And it is true that our very most senior leadership welcomes being challenged with facts, because we know that in the end, we're not the closest to the customer, we're not closest to the problem. So high degree of autonomy, data-driven decisions, low hierarchy, these are the kind of things we try and build our organization around. And we're now at like 700 people, and we're not slowing down yet. So fingers crossed, we'll cross 1,000 on the same basis.
Can you just tell me a bit about that conversation of how you joined, in the strategy role, what it felt like to go from, funding options to Allica? How did that play out?
Yeah, firstly, I'd stood down. I'd left funding options, the business I founded as the sole founder, about a year before the conversation took place. And I spent a year dabbling. I was advising other fintechs, most famously Anne Bowden, the founder of Starling Bank, one of our great fintechs. So I'd had a kind of happy year of dabbling and walking the dog. But I was kind of thinking what to do next. And I decided in that time off, I didn't want to go again. I didn't want to start another business. And I actually didn't want to be CEO again. Now, neither of those are necessarily forever decisions. I may well revisit one or both of those in the next few years. But at that point in time, I was enjoying, frankly, having my life back and having a bit of sanity as well. So the story behind it is our CEO had just taken over as CEO. He had basically a piece of paper saying you're a bank, but his job was to build a bank. And he and I had worked together at one of the big banks in strategy many years ago and stayed in touch and stayed on friendly terms. And actually, because I decided I didn't want to found again, I didn't want to be CEO, it was kind of the perfect opportunity because he's a much better CEO than I'll ever be. So I thought if I'm going to work for anyone, I'll work for him. So yeah. So he said, come on board. Why did he want me? He actually referred to range. So to get a bank license, you have to have people who've spent decades doing one thing in a bank: risk, finance, operations. And all these people are incredibly important, but I had breadth because I've been a CEO. So I always joke I'm Chief AOB Officer. So my portfolio, I've probably got 4 or 5 C-suite titles. I've got strategy, marketing, product. I've had data along the way. I've currently got impact. So the reality is quite a wide range of things sit under me. And it's turned out to be quite an important advantage by accident, actually, which is that I'm a great believer that things like marketing are part of an overall mix. They are tools in the toolbox. And because we have, through me, that kind of hopefully perfect alignment of product, strategy, and marketing, then the kind of dysfunctions that often happen, we don't have those to the same extent, or hopefully not at all.
Mm-hmm. And you talked before about generalists versus specialists in different stages of the business, because it sounds like you came in with a broad generalist role, but there's presumably, as you've gone on to reach a headcount of 700, there are sort of more and more specialized roles within the business, I suppose.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of my kind of theories around scaling up is that one of the things I always say, even to my leadership peers who haven't been through that, this is now the 3rd time I've been in one of the fastest growing companies in the UK. So for me, this is BAU now, is you cannot work 10 times harder when we're 10 times bigger. Yeah, it's just a simple mathematical fact. Yeah, there literally aren't enough hours in the week. So what is the art of scaling? You must obsess about attracting, coaching, and retaining the best talent in the market. And one of the reasons I've been able to, frankly, just survive in my role is because for each of the key functions that I'm responsible for, I've brought in, I've hopefully coached a little bit, but we usually it's the other way around. But above all, I also retained people who I trust to get the job done. So marketing, to the extent we have a CMO, it's me because I am the accountable executive for marketing, but I have a head marketing, and 90% of marketing is her, right? Versus my meager 10%. So it's about bringing in those people who you can trust and rely on to get the job done and to come to you when there are challenges and have an open discussion about it. And for me, it's been around making sure I've got all those people in place. And I talked about earlier, I love building things. So I've launched, typically I'll launch at least 1 or 2 products or channels every year. So I'm also a startup founder on the side. But again, I may be the tip of the spear when we launch the thing, but I very quickly look to bring in the person that can actually scale it for me and look after it. And it's that people element. Just to bring that to life, I think a lot of senior managers, when they think about talent, they think their job is to raise an HR request to hire somebody and say, tell me how you're getting on in a month's time. I see it as part of my job to go and hunt the best talent on the market. I'm active on LinkedIn, both reaching out to people, when people reach out to me that look interesting, I have a conversation with them, 15-minute chat, because I'm looking for those special people. That is a key part of my job. We cannot scale at our current rate unless I'm doing that.
Obviously, you have in the US, as at the time of filming, there's the Department of Government Efficiency. There's a few years ago in the UK, we had we were talking about it before filming this, but Dominic Cummings said he wanted to disrupt the civil service by hiring sort of more people you wouldn't normally hire. And I think you've talked before about how some corporate hiring processes are almost set up to filter out those more interesting thinkers. How can you set up processes that don't do that? How do you find the most interesting people, and how do you, I suppose, mold someone from, whatever it is, a teenager who's good at hacking or whatever it is, into somebody who will fit into an organization?
Yeah, I mean, let me just bring that to life. So a true story. When I was running my own startup, it was very hard to hire tech talent at the time. Partly there was a talent war, partly no one had heard of us, and everyone wanted to work at Monzo, right? So, for example, I found a significant number of our top or any of our developers on Reddit. Reddit, for those that don't know, is a social network for nerds, basically. And that was there was one little subreddit. It's called London for Hire, and we had one person who basically they had essentially failed their GCSEs. I think they had the odd D or F or something, but they'd essentially failed their GCSEs. They couldn't get a job. They couldn't get an interview because of the automatic filters. But the reason they'd failed their GCSEs is because they had personally in their bedroom been coding a lot of the Firefox browser. Yeah. So they'd been working on a big open source project when they were like 14. This person couldn't get an interview as a developer. Yeah. This is elite talent, right? So we were like, well, look, come down to London, come meet us, right? And we just needed to check that they were enough of a cultural fit, basically. Clearly the technical skills are going to be there. And another one is I had somebody where I was reading their CV and they'd obviously had no CV advice. It was just a bullet point list of tasks, basically. And there was no outcomes or deliverables. And then I was like, my God, this is going to be a long interview. Or sorry, I'm going to string this one out because it's going to be a short interview. I got to the bottom and it said they'd organised a festival at university. I'm like, thank God, okay, we've got something to talk about. Asked them about that. It turned out they'd personally organised a festival and 10,000 people had turned up. I couldn't do that, yeah? Not a hope in hell I could pull that off. So you kind of, what is it that makes someone special? Now, how have I crystallized that into something that I think is scalable and executable? My favorite interview question, and I've never heard of anyone else ask this. I say, what is your superpower? What's the one thing you're better at than anyone else? Okay. And some people say, well, you know, when I was at school, university, I was always the one that brought the assignment together, the team together. Okay, you're that kind of person. Or a completer finisher. Or they sometimes just see the world differently, which I think is my superpower. But basically, what is your superpower is a good way of kind of identifying. I get that you're going to be rubbish at many things, but is there something you're really born to? It's very often, by the way, in my interview, I'm kind of like, you're just kind of doing the wrong job. Yeah. From what you're telling me, you're doing the wrong job and you shouldn't be interviewing for this job because it's the same. Yeah. So yeah, what is your superpower is my scalable tool to do that.
Coming back to, you mentioned product market fit, and I think with Allica, you know, it's fine. It's an area that I think you've called the missing middle, or has been called that. But these people with complex requirements that are too complex for a mass market solution, but not lucrative enough for the big players to focus on. Can you sort of, and you've talked before about the book Blue Ocean Strategy. Can you sort of talk a bit about those things and how those kind of come together in your mind?
Yeah. So for those that haven't read Blue Ocean Strategy, firstly, do read Blue Ocean Strategy. But Blue Ocean Strategy is basically predicated on most markets are red oceans, and that's an analogy for a feeding frenzy, right? It's sharks in a feeding frenzy. Most markets are effectively a feeding frenzy. There's a number of very similar competitors doing very similar things. And in the end, you have two levers. You can reduce your prices or reduce your service, both of which in the long term will wreck your business. Unless your entire strategy is to be priced at like Walmart or Amazon. But the vast majority of people at lower prices don't do it strategically, they do it out of desperation. So most markets are red oceans, and most businesses that are founded are basically just another shark in the red ocean, okay? Occasionally somebody builds a blue ocean business, and a blue ocean business is one where they create an entirely new category. You can guess why it's blue, because it's big and there's no feeding frenzy. There's Cirque du Soleil, for example, is a blue ocean. It was a new type of thing. It was a bit of theatre and a bit of circus. But the point is, they very, very specific, Cirque du Soleil very, very specifically, what do people like about the circus, what they like about the theatre, what's kind of new thing will they value even more? We can price like a theatre, but have a circus-like experience. There are many, many examples, by the way. So Allica is a blue ocean strategy. Businesses of a certain size, typically between 10 and 100 employees, really struggle with the big banks because the big banks find them awkward because they kind of sit between consumer banking, which is tens of millions of ordinary people, simple ordinary people like us, and corporate banking, which is a few thousand big businesses like BP and Vodafone. Businesses of a certain scale, they're really awkward. They're too complicated for consumer banking, but they're too low value for Vodafone type banking. And they get underserved and they're quite angry. They have low NPS. It's a third of the economy that's being left untouched. It's a classic blue ocean. And our thesis was basically if we built from scratch everything, technology, operating people, everything to focus on solving the problems of that particular segment, we could give them a dramatically better service and value and much better economics for ourselves. And that's the core of our competitive strategy. But the point is basically everything we've ever done in terms of marketing and sales, if we didn't have a blue ocean in the first place, it would have been 10 times harder. Yeah. That's the key point, right? So if you don't align your strategy and then your product and marketing, strategy, product, and then marketing and sales, then in the end, you're pushing against a closed door, not an open door, which is why it's so important to kind of align the three things.
And the book mentions it's not just adding extra value for customers, but also reducing costs at the same time. So I think that the Cirque du Soleil example, they cut, or for example, having circus animals and things, but they also added the theatre, narrative and themes and things to that. So so that's a sort of crucial thing that maybe people, when they presented this thesis, they said this is a fundamental shift in strategic thinking away from the sort of military. I think they compare it to a military metaphor where you're fighting on fixed terrain against an opponent, and this is a completely different way of viewing business, I suppose.
Yeah, and by the way, blue ocean is gets you out there, right? But in the end, 3 years down the line, the question then becomes, how do you're going to have a chasing pack. We have been so successful. I mean, we're not just the fastest growing company in the UK, but we're also profitable, right? Which is disappointingly rare in the fintech land, unfortunately. So clearly you have people saying, okay, we need to think about this, respond to this, not just other challenges, but actually the big incumbents we now know are taking a very close look. But the reality is, right, if we maintain our speed and our kind of focus on making, capturing insight data quicker than others and responding and reacting to that data more quickly, that kind of like feedback loop, then we may well have new competitors building Allica circa 2024, but I'm building Allica circa 2027 at the moment. And Allica circa 2027 is a very different beast, very exciting beast as well. So you've got to keep that culture of being youthful and fresh. That's how you sustain it over time. But the blue ocean is the entry point into the market.
And in terms of marketing, obviously Allica has gone hugely into brand marketing recently. You've got the pin there that demonstrates the brand. So can you sort of talk a bit about that and maybe how the push into the brand campaign has sort of, how that links back to some of the thinking you've been talking about?
Yeah. So I've been on a personal journey with brands, and actually I'm in many ways I was the kind of irritating stakeholder that most of your listeners will be dealing with all the time, which is everyone thinks they're a marketeer. So I was CEO of a business I founded, right? So I kind of thought, and marketing, it's kind of like I feel I'd be good at marketing. In some bits of marketing I turned out I was quite good at, but actually brands, absolutely not. So I'd come from a corporate background, and I was very, very conservative in how I thought about brands. The name Funding Options, it was like, it's just a descriptive term. But the website was kind of like just oozed corporate respectability, trust and reliability. In other words, it was completely unmemorable. I was talking to an advisor about something completely unrelated, and they said, look, you don't need me. They were talking about category creation, as we were talking about. He said, look, you don't need me. Your problem, the stuff that I can tell you about, you know it all. Your problem is, Conrad, you're just boring, yeah? I can't even remember the name of the company, right? You need a brand consultancy. So I got a brand consultancy, and I hunted down the one that had done the work for the top player in our industry. So I kind of thought, they're beating me, so I better go and join them. And you know what? They were just honest with me. They said, look, Conrad, there's 100 agencies in London as good as we are. It's the world centre of brand agencies. In the end, whether this succeeds or not will come down to whether you're brave enough to do something that's going to cut through. And we did some rebrand work, and there were moments where I was wincing and gulping. But in the end, I kind of learnt the hard way that you've got to be bold. And what they basically said, if you're not willing to be bold, don't waste the money on a brand agency. Yeah. So I've learnt a lot about brand along the way. And Allica, my kind of central thesis is really simple. It's going to be a long time until the average customer in our segment knows the name Allica, but they will remember the orange hat. Yeah, so we have a brand icon. That's our strategy, and they see us on the TV ads. They see us on billboards. The point is that when that moments that matter, when they click on an advert and land on our website, or when they meet one of our team and they see the lapel badge, it's like, okay, you're the orange hat guys. That's how I think about this. But the orange hat is meant to align to our tagline, our proposition. We say we are how business banking used to be, just better. And the Brits will probably understand that the bowler hat, this hat is an icon of British banking. but they were never orange. So it's designed to be how business banking used to be, just better. And it's cutting through really well, really excited about it.
Sort of, I suppose, drawing a thread across all of what we talked about then, you've worked in the corporate world, you've worked in the fintech world. I suppose, what's your sort of theory of your career and what you want from it, and how does that sort of tie together?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've only literally in the last couple of years, I had kind of an epiphany. I have the occasional epiphany because, look, we could all spout some Instagram nonsense about purpose and stuff like that. The reality is, I've come to the regrettable conclusion that I quite enjoy being comfortably off. So, am I going to become the next Mother Teresa? I think the straight answer is no. Doesn't necessarily reflect well on me, but it's the truth. So I actually had an epiphany. I think I was on holiday or something. You know what my career purpose is? I want to be sufficiently wealthy that I can have a nice, interesting and relaxing retirement. Yeah. But not do it in such a way that I spend that time I have off regretting the things that I did. Yeah. And in that respect, I've had the happy happenstance that I've ended up my career over the last 15 years by luck, not judgment, has been serving SMEs, ordinary businesses. I really love ordinary businesses. I've been a business owner myself, clearly. So I've kind of found something where I kind of feel what I do is fundamentally good for the world. I'm not making some huge claim, but the reality is, right, local businesses are good. Yeah. They're good for communities, they're good for local employment, they're good for local culture. If you take the average, a few dozen small businesses out of the average town, that town is dead. So I kind of feel that what I'm doing is certainly not a social bad. Therefore, I won't regret it when I'm hopefully having a reasonably comfortable retirement.
So that's the vision, and then there's the the details are more flexible. But you've got, that's a sort of driving thing for you. It's that connection with small businesses.
A way to make money that is also at least not bad for the world, but hopefully a bit good for the world. That kind of intersection is probably about as far as I'll go on the Mother Teresa route. Yeah.
Great. Well, it's been really interesting to talk to you, Conrad. Thanks for sharing so many of your thoughts and your experiences. And we'll see you at a forum event very soon, I think.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.